Zahara Vienne never expected a split-second instinct to rewrite her life or place her in the crosshairs of the most feared man in the Korean underworld. On a night when the Han River turned into a churning, violent grave, she saw what the world's most powerful guards had missed: a small boy, Baek Hain, disappearing beneath the icy, black current. As the elite city of Seoul huddled under umbrellas, Zahara dove into the abyss. When she finally crawled back onto the rain-slicked pavement, her braids drenched and clinging to her face, she was no longer just a nurse. She was a shield. She knelt on the neon-lit street, her worn jacket soaked through, clutching the unconscious child to her chest with a raw, fierce protectiveness. She didn't notice the laser sights blooming on her forehead or the circle of black-clad men with drawn weapons. She didn't see the man standing behind her, Yoon Haegwon, the Iron King, whose very name turned the city cold, watching her with a dangerous, narrowed intensity. She only knew that the boy's heart had stopped, and she wasn't about to let it stay that way. When the king's guards moved to seize the child, Zahara didn't cower. She snarled a command to stay back, her eyes wide with resolve as she breathed life back into his son's lungs. She didn't know she was the first person to ever deny Yoon Haegwon. She didn't know that by saving the boy, something inside the ruthless king had shifted, locking his entire world and his lethal obsession onto her. The neon pulse of Seoul was a blur of electric blues and harsh pinks, but for Zahara Vienne, the city was a relentless machine of gray stone and endless stairs. 2 years into her stay, the dream of a fresh start had been ground down into a survival routine that left her bones aching and her spirit thin. To the residents of the towering apartments, she was just the foreign nurse, a ghost in faded scrubs who worked the graveyard shifts no one else wanted, all to feed the bottomless hunger of the medical debts her father had left behind. She had just finished a grueling 16-hour double shift at the municipal hospital, her feet swollen and her mind foggy from the smell of antiseptic and the sound of monitors. A torrential downpour had turned the city into a watercolor painting, the rain lashing against the skyscrapers and turning the Han River into a churning, violent beast. Zahara pulled her worn jacket tighter, the fabric long since soaked through, as she trudged along the riverbank path to catch the last bus. The river roared beside her, its water dark and swollen, carrying debris toward the sea. Most people had cleared the streets, seeking the warmth of heated floors and steaming tea. But then, through the rhythmic thrum of the rain, she saw it, a splash that didn't belong to the wind. A small figure, no more than 8 years old, was struggling against the current. He had been standing on the slick concrete edge, perhaps lured by the sheer power of the water, and now he was being swept away. His small hands clawed at the air, his face a pale mask of terror before the black water pulled him under again. Zahara didn't calculate the risk. She didn't think about the cold or the fact that she was exhausted to the point of collapse. Her body moved on a decade of instinct, the nurse in her overriding the survivor. She dropped her bag and dove. The water hit her like a wall of ice, stealing the air from her lungs. The current was a physical hand, trying to drag her into the deep, but she fought it with a primal strength she didn't know she possessed. She spotted a tuft of dark hair and a small, flailing arm. With a desperate surge, she lunged forward, her fingers locking around the boy's soaked collar. "I've got you," she gasped, though the river swallowed her words. She kicked toward the bank, her muscles screaming, her vision tunneling. When her hand finally struck the rough concrete of the embankment, she hauled both of them upward, gasping for air that felt like needles. She collapsed onto the rain-slicked pavement, the boy limp in her arms. In the distance, the sirens of a black motorcade wailed, but Zahara only saw the child's blue lips and the terrifying silence of his chest. She began to pump, her wet braids slapping against her face, unaware that the eyes of the Underworld King were already fixed upon her back. The transition from the drowning roar of the Han River to the absolute, suffocating silence of the Yoon estate was a disorientation Zahara couldn't shake. When she finally opened her eyes, she wasn't on the cold pavement or in a sterile hospital ward. She was lying on a bed of Egyptian cotton in a room that smelled of expensive cedar and rain. The walls were lined with silk, and the light was dim, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that shut out the chaos of the city. She sat up, her body screaming in protest. Her wet braids had been dried and fanned out across the pillow, and someone had replaced her ruined scrubs with a robe of heavy, midnight silk. Before she could panic, the shadow in the corner moved. Yoon Haegwon stood by the window, his silhouette sharp enough to cut the air. He wasn't wearing the long coat from the riverbank. Instead, he wore a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a tattoo climbing his neck. He didn't move toward her, but the weight of his gaze was a physical pressure against her chest. "His name is Hain," Haegwon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "The doctors said your technique was perfect. Had you been 5 seconds slower, I would be preparing a funeral." Zahara's voice was a dry rasp. "Where is he? I need to see the patient." "He is sleeping, and he is asking for the woman who breathed for him," Haegwon replied, finally stepping into the light. His features were beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a polished blade. "I know who you are, Zahara Vienne. I know about the apartment in Chicago you lost. I know about the 3 jobs you work in my city just to pay off a dead man's debts. I know the collectors are waiting for you at your door." Zahara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river. "Are you threatening me?" "I am offering you a sanctuary," he countered, his eyes narrowing. "This house is a fortress, but it is a silent one. My son has not spoken or touched another soul willingly in years. But tonight, he reached for you. You are the only person he trusts." He walked to the bedside, leaning down until he was inches from her face. The scent of him, smoke and cold metal, filled her senses. "Stay here. Be his guardian, his healer, his shadow. In exchange, your debts will vanish by dawn. You will never have to work a double shift again." "And if I refuse?" Haegwon straightened, his expression returning to that of the Iron King. "Then you walk out that door, back to the rain and the men who want your money. I do not force guests to stay. But if you leave my son in the dark. Choose, Zahara, the freedom of the streets or the safety of my cage." Zahara looked at the door, then thought of the boy's pale face in the water. She realized with a sinking heart that the king hadn't just bought her dead. He had discovered the one thing she couldn't walk away from. She reached out and took the glass of water from the nightstand, her hand steadying as she looked him in the eye. "I'll stay for the boy." The first morning in the Yoon estate felt like waking up inside a masterpiece where the air was too thin to breathe. Zahara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new suite, watching the rain-washed city of Seoul stretch out below. She felt like a trespasser in her own life. Her phone, a cracked device that had been her primary source of anxiety for years, sat on a mahogany side table. It was silent for the first time in months. No automated collection calls, no threatening texts from the private lenders who had hounded her since her father's funeral. A soft chime at the door preceded Haegwon. He entered with the silent, predatory grace that seemed to be his default state, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor. In his hand, he held a sleek, new tablet. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He simply handed her the device. "Log into your bank portal," he commanded. Zahara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. "Why?" "Because a debt is a chain, and I do not want my son's guardian distracted by the rattling of links," he said, his voice as cold as the marble floors. With a trembling hand, Zahara entered her credentials. She braced herself for the familiar sight of the deep red numbers, the negative balance that had felt like a death sentence. But as the page refreshed, her breath hitched. The balance wasn't just zero. Every pending medical bill, every outstanding loan, and every cent of the predatory interest that had kept her awake at night had been cleared. The status of every account read, "Paid in full." "How?" she whispered, looking up at him in shock. "This was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would have taken me decades." Haegwon didn't look impressed by the sum. He leaned against the wall, the shadow of his neck tattoo visible beneath his collar. "A single phone call to the bank's chairman." "I suggested that his continued prosperity depended on the immediate resolution of your clerical errors." He was very eager to comply. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just wealth. It was the kind of terrifying, absolute power that could rewrite a person's history with a sentence. She wasn't just working for a rich man. She was under the protection and the thumb of a man who could bend the city's institutions to his will. "You've bought me," she said, her voice tight with a mix of relief and resentment. "I have freed you," Haegwon corrected, his gaze fixing on hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "There is a difference. You no longer owe the world anything, Zahara. You only owe me your care for Haeng. Consider the slate clean." He turned to leave, his long shadow retreating across the room. Zahara looked back at the screen, the weight of the debt gone, only to be replaced by the heavy, gold-plated realization that she was now firmly within the king's shadow, and in his world, nothing was ever truly free. The clinical silence of the estate was gradually being replaced by a new kind of atmosphere, one defined by the soft, rhythmic tapping of Zahara's fingers against the wooden surfaces of the nursery. For weeks, she had stayed by Haen's side, not as a warden, but as a steady presence. She had learned that the boy's trauma wasn't just in his lungs from the river water. It was in the way he flinched at loud noises and the way his eyes searched the corners of the room for threats only he could see. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the rain had finally ceased, leaving the gardens outside sparkling with dew. Zahara sat on the floor, humming a low, resonant melody from her childhood, a song her father used to sing when the world felt too heavy. She was focused on folding a paper crane, her hands moving with a nurse's precision. Haen sat inches away, his gaze fixed on her dark, nimble fingers. Suddenly, a small, cold hand reached out and touched the edge of the paper. Zahara froze, her heart skipping a beat, but she didn't look up. She kept humming, allowing him the space to choose this connection. "Are you an angel?" The voice was tiny, a mere ghost of a sound that seemed to vibrate directly from his soul. It was the first time his vocal cords had worked since the Han River had tried to claim him. The words were hesitant, spoken in a soft Korean dialect, but the wonder behind them was unmistakable. Zahara turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. The boy was looking at her with a mix of awe and confusion, his small face finally breaking into a shy, tentative smile, the kind of light that could bankrupt a king's empire. "No, Haen," she whispered, her own eyes glistening. "I'm just Zahara. I'm just someone who wanted to make sure you were okay." Haen's smile widened, a tiny gap showing where a milk tooth had recently fallen out. "You're the lady from the water. You brought the air back." In the darkened hallway, just beyond the reach of the room's warm glow, Yoon Haegwon stood perfectly still. His hand was braced against the doorframe, his knuckles white. He had spent his entire life building walls, convinced that emotion was a lethal flaw in his world of shadows. But as he watched his son's face transform, as he heard the voice he feared he would never hear again, the ice around his own heart began to hairline fracture. He didn't step forward. He didn't want to break the magic of the moment. He simply watched the South African woman who had invaded his fortress and realized she wasn't just a nurse he had hired. She was the only person who had ever walked into his house and brought the sun with her. As Haen laughed for the first time, a short, breathless sound, Haegwon felt a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. The Iron King was beginning to melt, and the realization was more terrifying than any war he had ever fought. The stillness of the estate had begun to feel like a held breath, so when Haegwon suggested a rare excursion into the heart of Seoul, Zahara felt a flicker of the woman she used to be. He didn't take her to a gala or a hidden club. He took her to a quiet, elevated park overlooking the Han River, the very place that had nearly claimed Haeng. The city was a sprawling tapestry of neon gold and sapphire, the lights reflecting off the dark water like fallen stars. Haegwon walked beside her, his presence no longer a threat but a grounding force. He had shed his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful architecture of his forearms. For a moment, amidst the hum of distant traffic and the cool night breeze, they weren't a king and a captive. They were simply a man and a woman standing on the edge of a world they were both trying to survive. I haven't walked through the city like this in years, Haegwon admitted, his voice low and unusually vulnerable. I forgot that the lights could be beautiful instead of just a map of territory. Zahara looked at him, the neon glow catching the sharp line of his jaw. You spend so much time looking for shadows that you've forgotten how to stand in the light, Haegwon. He turned to her, and for a heartbeat, the air between them thickened with something unsaid, a magnetic pull that transcended debt and duty. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, his thumb grazing the edge of her jawline. Maybe I just needed someone to show me where to look, he whispered. The moment was perfect, a fragile crystal of peace in a life of iron. But then Zahara saw it. A tiny pinprick of crimson light, no larger than a ladybug, danced across the dark fabric of her jacket. It moved with a jittery, lethal precision, climbing upward until it settled squarely over her heart. The blood in Zahara's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what that light meant. It was the eye of a predator, a mechanical promise of death. Haegwon, she breathed, her voice paralyzed. He saw it a microsecond later. The transformation was instantaneous. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the predator who had earned the name Iron King. With a guttural snarl, he lunged, his hand slamming into her shoulder to throw her toward the ground. Down, he roared. As they hit the cold pavement, the crack of a high-velocity rifle shattered the night, the bullet whistling through the space where Zahara's chest had been a heartbeat before. The neon paradise was gone, replaced by the screaming of sirens and the cold, hard reality of the crown she had unknowingly agreed to share. The date wasn't an escape, it was a declaration of war. The safe return to the estate was no victory. It was the beginning of a siege that started not with a bang, but with a stagger. As the iron gates hissed shut behind them, Haegwon suddenly leaned his weight against the marble wall of the foyer. His face, usually a mask of bronze-like resolve, turned a sickly, ashen gray. He clutched his throat, a jagged, wet cough tearing from his lungs that left dark flecks on his white silk cuff. Haegwon. Zahara caught him before his knees hit the floor. Her medical instincts, sharpened by years of trauma wards, overrode her fear. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery. His pulse was a frantic, irregular drumbeat, thready and racing. His pupils were pinpricks, and a fine tremor had seized his hands. The tea. Haegwon wheezed, his eyes unfocused. In the car, my own men. The realization hit Zahara like a physical blow. The sniper in the park hadn't been the primary plan. It had been the distraction. The true assassin was someone close enough to touch his cup. This was a coup, a silent poison designed to paralyze the king so the scavengers could move in. Suddenly, the power cut. The estate was plunged into a suffocating, velvet darkness, save for the strobing red of the emergency backup lights. Outside, the familiar sound of the security detail was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots and the shattering of glass in the lower levels. The Iron King was down, and the wolves were at the door. Get him to the medical suite. Zahara commanded the 2 guards who remained loyal, her voice ringing with an authority that brooked no argument. Inside the darkened clinic, she moved with a cold, clinical fury. She didn't have a full toxicology lab, but she recognized the symptoms of a concentrated neurotoxin. She scavenged the cabinets, her hands steady as she prepared an atropine injection and a charcoal slurry. Stay with me, Haegwon, she whispered, leaning close to his ear as the sound of gunfire erupted in the courtyard. You cleared my debts. Now I'm clearing yours. Don't you dare stop breathing. As she pushed the needle into his vein, the door to the suite groaned under the weight of a battering ram. Zahara grabbed a surgical scalpel, the only weapon she knew how to wield, and stood over the man who had become her world. She was a healer in a house of killers, but as the shadows moved toward them, she realized she was willing to stain her hands red to keep his heart beating. The nurse from Chicago was gone. In her place stood the protector of the king's life, and she would not let the rhythm break. The medical suite's emergency lights pulsed a rhythmic, warning red as the steel doors groaned under the impact of a second battering ram. Haegwon lay unconscious on the table, his breathing finally stabilizing under Zahara's care, but he was a dead weight they couldn't move in time. Zahara knew the wolves outside weren't here to negotiate. They were here to erase the king's lineage. "Hain, look at me," Zahara whispered, pulling the trembling boy from beneath a surgical trolley. She gripped his shoulders, her eyes burning with a fierce, maternal light that brooked no argument. "We have to play a game. The quietest game we've ever played. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, his small hand clutching the hem of her blood-stained scrub top. Zahara reached behind a mahogany bookshelf, pressing a hidden recessed panel Haegwon had shown her during a tour of the fortress weeks ago. With a hiss of hydraulics, a section of the wall slid back to reveal a narrow, stone-lined passage that smelled of cold earth and old copper. They slipped inside just as the suite's doors burst open with a roar of splintering metal. Zahara eased the panel shut, plunging them into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. She didn't have a weapon, only her stethoscope draped around her neck and the clinical map of the estate she had memorized. "Keep the rhythm, Hain," she breathed into the dark, counting their steps in her head to navigate the maze. 1, 2, 3, turn. Above them, the house screamed with the sounds of boots and muffled gunfire. Through the narrow ventilation slats, Zahara could see the beams of tactical flashlights cutting through the dust like blades. She stopped, pressing Hain against the damp wall as the voices of two assassins echoed directly above their heads. "He isn't in the vault," one snarled. "Find the woman. She has the boy." Zahara's pulse hammered against her ribs, but she forced her breath to remain slow and silent, the same technique she used to calm her pediatric patients. She noticed a heavy iron lever used to control the estate's old gas-fed heating system. As the footsteps paused directly over a floor grate, Zahara didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the lever, releasing a pressurized hiss of diverted steam into the corridor above. The screams of the scalded men provided the diversion she needed. "Now," she hissed, scooping Hain into her arms and sprinting toward the passage that led to the boathouse. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the lioness protecting the cub in a jungle of concrete and steel. She had saved him from the river's current, and she would save him from this one, too. The exit light flickered in the distance, a small, white star at the end of a long, dark tunnel. They were close, but the shadows were closing in. The damp air of the boathouse was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, a stark contrast to the sterile, bloody chaos they had left behind in the tunnels. Zahara pushed Hain behind a stack of heavy industrial crates, her breath coming in ragged hitches as she watched the estate's main pier through the cracked window. Outside, the night was a theater of war. The rain had returned, turning the neon lights of the city across the water into a blurry, distorted smear of blue and red. In the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the remnants of his burning empire, stood Yoon Haegwon. He was pale, his shirt torn and soaked with rain and the sweat of a man fighting off a neurotoxin by sheer force of will. He looked less like a king and more like a fallen god, but the handgun in his grip was steady as a mountain. Facing him was the man behind the betrayal, Executive Director Choi, a man who had traded his loyalty for a chance at the Iron Throne. Choi was flanked by a dozen armed men, their weapons trained on Haegwon's chest. "It's over, Haegwon." Choi's voice carried over the wind, cold and triumphant. "The port of Busan has already flipped. The board has voted. You are a king without a country. Give us the boy, hand over the girl, and I might let you take a boat to the horizon and never look back. Why die for a stray nurse and a broken child?" Zahara watched from the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Haegwon's head tilt back, a dark, hollow laugh escaping his throat. He didn't look at Choi. He looked toward the boathouse, his gaze unerringly finding the small gap in the window where Zahara stood. "You think this throne was my life?" Haegwon shouted, his voice cracking with a raw, terrifying honesty. "I built this empire out of ash because I had nothing else to hold. I thought the blood on my hands was the only thing that made me real." He took a step forward, ignoring the red laser dots that suddenly bloomed across his white shirt. But she showed me a heartbeat I had forgotten, he continued, his eyes fixed on Zahara's silhouette. She saved my son from the river, and she saved me from the machine. If being a king means watching them bleed, then I choose to be nothing. Take the ports. Take the money. Burn the syndicate to the ground. But if you touch a single hair on their heads, I will turn this city into a graveyard before I fall. With a roar that was neither a command nor a threat, but a final, soul-cleansing choice, Haegwon dropped his weapon into the mud. He stood defenseless, offering his life in exchange for their escape. In that moment, Zahara realized the Iron King was gone. The man standing in the rain was something far more powerful, a father, a lover, and a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for. The transition from the iron-fisted rule of the Lee Syndicate to the birth of the Yoon Foundation did not happen overnight, but it began the moment Haegwon reached for Zahara's hand in the ring. True to his word, the man who had once been the Shadow Emperor of Seoul spent the following years systematically dismantling the machine he had built. He liquidated the ports, severed ties with the dark corners of the peninsula, and turned the vast, ill-gotten wealth of the underworld into a beacon of legitimacy. The blood money was washed clean, not through more violence, but through the building of hospitals, music centers, and the very pediatric wing that now bore Zahara's family name. The wedding was held not in a high-society ballroom, but in the quiet, sun-drenched gardens of the estate, the place where Hain had first spoken his truth. There were no cameras, no rival chairmen, and no hidden weapons. There was only a man who had traded his crown for a family, and a woman who had finally found a place where her heartbeat felt like home. Zahara wore a dress of white lace that contrasted beautifully with her deep complexion, her braids adorned with small, golden beads that caught the light as she walked toward the man who had become her sanctuary. Hain stood between them, no longer a trembling boy lost in the current, but a thriving child who carried the wedding rings with a proud, steady gait. When he reached Zahara, he didn't pull away. He hugged her waist, a physical testament to the bridge she had built between his silence and the world. "I choose you," Haegwon whispered as they exchanged vows, his voice thick with a peace that had once seemed impossible. Not as a king, but as a man who finally knows what it means to be alive. Zahara looked at the man who had cleared her father's debts and filled the hollow spaces of her soul. She thought of the cold Chicago winds and the terrifying roar of the Han River. She realized then that her life had never been about running away. It had been a long, difficult journey toward this specific garden. She wasn't a guest in a cage anymore. She was the heart of a new kingdom built on choice and rhythm. As the sun set over Seoul, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold, the city below continued its frantic pace. But inside the gates of the legacy they had built together, the air was still. Zahara leaned her head against Haegwon's shoulder, watching Hain run across the grass toward his gem. For the first time in her life, she didn't look at the exit. She didn't check the time. She simply closed her eyes and listened to the steady, perfect rhythm of a family that was no longer drowning, but finally, beautifully, at rest. Some loves are too powerful for endings, and for the girl from Chicago and the king of Seoul, the music was only just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you love the story, hit that like button, leave a comment with your favorite parts, and subscribe to Mafia Secret Love Stories so you don't miss out on our next story.